All right, so a Buddhist monk and an English teacher continue to read Stoner and continue to have issues with what is allegedly the greatest novel you've never read. All right, so welcome back to Please Read Your Book. My name is Carl, and I'm joined with Lekden from Reading from the Depths. And we're going to talk about the second half of Stoner by John Willams. And I guess to backtrack, we kind of left off with sort of that confrontation with Walker.
Yeah, we ended on the chapter where he met Walker and Catherine, and he had this confrontation with Walker, and he lusted after Catherine, but didn't do anything about it. And it was a very cliffhanger way to end. So it was very appropriate ending, actually.
Yeah. We chose a good time to stop, actually. And we were kind of trying to predict what was going to happen in the second half of the book, and we were looking for parallels between. I thought there'd be some kind of parallel between the death of Sloane and the death of Stoner. But we won't get to that because that obviously comes right at the end of the book. So we were just having a quick chat before we started recording. You said you had an issue with Stoner and with Willams.
Yeah, so I've changed my tune on the book a little bit, and which is to say I enjoyed the book. I had a good time with the book. I realized that I was invested in Stoner, and the reason I was so frustrated is because he kept making these awful decisions, and his life was so like sad and miserable that it didn't have to be. And I realized, I think so I finished the book and I was thinking about it, and I wasn't sure how I felt because I had these feelings about the book, and never mind, I still think it was beautifully written. I just have all these things pulled out of like really beautiful phrases, and just the way he crafts the story, I think are really great, and the way he dramatizes a quotidian life, kind of, I thought was really beautiful. But I was still frustrated, and what kind of shook me out of it was I listened to a podcast recently with a philosophy professor and a psychology professor, and they were discussing Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find. And in the introduction to that story, or in the introduction to their podcast, they said like that Flannery O'Connor said such and such and such about that story. And they're like, yeah, that seems total nonsense. Like neither of them agreed with what she said, what her story was about. And I realized that was my problem, is that I don't agree at all with what John Williams says about Stoner in the introduction of this book. And, to be fair, this introduction was written in 2002. So I think everyone on BookTube that has become fascinated with Stoner has read this introduction, right? Because that was in the 2002 edition. And the introduction was, the quote from John Williams is from 1985. And it was when he was retiring his post. And so the book had been published for 20 years, but not gained a lot of traction, right? And it was him retiring from his post at university where he'd worked his whole life. And I'm sure he had feelings about Stoner not being as popular as maybe he thought it was, because it's the book that is definitely closest to his life, right? And his experience. So his quote from that 1985 interview that's given in the introduction, and we talked about it last time, but how he says, I think he's a real hero. A lot of people who have read the novel think that Stoner has such a sad and bad life. I think he had a very good life. He had a better life than most people do, certainly. And I think that's just nonsense. Like, I think it was a very sad life. And so skipping to the end, I think he had a beautiful death, and I think he managed to reconcile his life in a way that was meaningful to him at the end, right, of his life. And that is beautiful.
Yeah.
And that is, in many ways, most important parts of our life. As a Buddhist, we especially say having a calm mind at the moment of death is incredibly important. So no matter the ups and downs, whatever travails you experience in your life, having a good death is important. So I thought that was beautiful, but he didn't have a good life. He suffered depression after depression. He suffered setback after setback, many of them due to his poor choices, but his poor choices were informed by just not being informed. It wasn't like he was, acting like outrageously. He just didn't have the means around him to make good choices quite a lot. The biggest decision he made that was kind of from his own ego was his insistence on failing Walker, and how that played out, and his holding, sticking to his guns in that circumstance. So I didn't think he had a great life. I think especially he had moments of real beauty in his life, and he lost them all. Many of them because he chose to give them up. Like his life with Catherine, he chose to give that up because he said, if I left and we moved away together, we wouldn't be ourselves. That was his logic, that we wouldn't be ourselves anymore. So he
Mm,
gave up the one moment of happiness he had, however many months
mm,
that was, and
mm.
he went into this great depression. And then he
Yep.
ended up, from that depression, had these disassociative states, which are very beautifully written about him
Mm,
staring at the snow, exiting his body. But for me, I read that as like a severe traumatic dissociative state. Like it is a traumatic psychological event, right? It
mhm.
isn't him blissing out. It isn't him being happy. He goes into a disassociative state, which comes back again and again throughout that semester. So I read
Yeah.
that as highly unfortunate and like not a happy life, not a blissed out life, not a pleasant life. So he had an
Mhm.
overwhelmingly depressing life that had like intermittent moments of joy that he
Yeah.
just refused to grab onto, that he accepted when they came and he refused to grab onto them. And I think Williams knows that. Like even at the end of the book, right? As it's this is, I mean, jumping to the end, but before his death, in the last chapter, he says, dispassionately, reasonably, he contemplated the failure that his life must appear to be. He had wanted friendship and the closeness of friendship that might hold him in the race of mankind. He had had two friends, one of whom had died senselessly before he was known, the other of whom had now withdrawn so distantly into the ranks of the living that he had wanted the singleness and the connective passion of marriage. He had had that too, and he had not known what to do with it, and it had died. He had wanted love, and he had love, and he had relinquished it, let it go into the chaos of potentiality. Catherine, he thought, Catherine. And he had wanted to be a teacher, and he had become one, yet he knew he had
Mhm.
always known that for the most of his life, he had been an indifferent one. He had dreamed of a kind of integrity, a kind of purity that was entire, and he had found compromise in the assaulting diversion of triviality. He conceived
Mhm.
wisdom, and at the end of long years he had found ignorance. And what else, he thought? What else? What did you expect? He asked himself.
Mm.
That doesn't sound like a happy life. That sounds like you're reviewing your life and
Yeah.
it being wildly disappointing,
Yep.
you know? So that once I realized that I don't agree with Williams, that this is an example of a hero, an example of someone who lived a meaningful life.
Yep.
And I don't agree with the many booktubers who seem to think that this is a portrait of like a contemplative life that is wildly accepting, um,
Yep.
that is not a hero, but that he has like staying content with the ups and downs of life. Once I realized I don't
Mm.
agree with that, then I think it's a beautiful character study that is
Mm.
incredibly well written and is quite poignant in the way it writes. And you see a person go through such difficulty, make bad decisions, and yet at the end of his life be able to come to a sense of peace within himself, regardless of
Mhm.
how poor his life was. So once I realized that, I realized I enjoyed the book, as long as I don't
Mm.
agree with John Williams
Mm.
or the many fans of the book.
Yeah. That's an interesting analysis. I had similar, but not the same. I saw those disassociative moments after Catherine left as just the foreshadowing of his death.
Mm,
And that, and I also wondered too, like, is that like the cancer perhaps
mhm,
had, maybe that's like the first kind of internal signal of the cancer. Um, a couple things. I thought his death was beautiful, like very well written. I also found it to be just really cliched and frustrating because it's the final, literally his final moment, or it may not, he
mhm,
may not even be still alive. Who knows? But somehow he's finally thinking about his life.
mhm.
And although it's really well written, it's just, again, I just find it so hard to believe that someone who becomes an English professor cannot examine their life until the very moment of death.
Yeah,
It's just like, that's this what I said before, and I know I sound like a bit of a broken record, but it's such a frustrating book for me because he never has a moment where he sits down and has some kind of like, whether it's just like a mental breakdown or just a night of drinking and talking with the guys and saying like, oh my god, what the hell am I doing, why my wife is this psycho, or I'm having this affair, like all these kinds of things. Like, these are things that happen to people and they're all very realistic, but people
yeah.
do stop, even if it's just for a moment, stop and examine their life and say like, hey, wait a minute,
We hope so.
what am I doing here? Or like, I've done this again and I'm still unhappy again, like it's just so frustrating, especially someone who's supposedly so well educated and who is well read. Obviously, he's going to have read literature in which characters do that. So I
Yeah.
just had a hard time buying into it. And I totally agree with you that I don't agree with what so many people in blogs and booktubes and that kind of stuff say, that this is such a beautiful life, such a contemplative book. There's no contemplation in this book
Mm.
until the moment that he dies,
Yeah, but I think the
you know?
contemplation really is from the reader. Like for me, being able to see his life and see him make these decisions, like that's a moment for me to be like, you know, what would I have done in that circumstance? And like repeatedly seeing him so wedded to literature, like the one fight that he makes in his life is for
Mm,
academia, for literature. Like the one time he stands his ground is with
mm,
Walker, right? And it's not even, and it started out because Walker was so like caustic and he thought he was,
yeah,
acting so inappropriate in the class
yeah,
with like lying about his final exam. But he even says in that section when he's listening to that final exam, it, his anger transformed to pity as part of it. Or maybe it was during the exam. No, it was during the when he was sitting for his admission or whatever it was. Like when Walker was sitting for his
yeah,
exam or when he was
yeah,
giving his
yeah,
presentation. I'm
yeah,
not exactly sure what it was, but he was angry at first. He was incredibly angry, and then that turned into pity, right?
yep,
So
yep,
that is the moment that he stood his ground because it was about academia. And his whole point was like, he is
mm,
going to be teaching people one day, and that is not appropriate. Like, we can't co-sign that to let him
yep,
become a professor because
yep,
it is so inappropriate. But
yep,
everywhere else in his life, he didn't make a stand, right? He
mm,
didn't fight for his marriage. He didn't fight for his daughter. His daughter,
yep,
look at what a tragedy his daughter's life turned into.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
he didn't fight for any of those things. And
yeah,
so for me, the contemplative part isn't that he was contemplative because he wasn't, not in
mm,
the moment, but it's for me looking at it and seeing decision after decision after decision, which all seemed like small decisions. And they all seemed like he was acquiescing to make other people happy or to avoid disruption. But then as a
mm,
consequence of that, what happened was that he got himself deeper and deeper into a hole that he never could come out of. Right.
mm,
So for me,
mm,
contemplation is from my side. I don't think he was contemplative, but I think it offers a lot of opportunity for me to see the points in my life where I'm facing difficulty and how I
mm,
negotiate that and how I
mm,
either acquiesce or I hold my ground. You know,
mm, yeah,
but for me, that was where it's contemplative. I don't think he was. I agree 100%. So I
yeah,
don't know. I'd
yeah,
expect it to be like I don't know. I think you and I lead very different lives considering we're both from America and we have traveled around the world and now we live in alternative countries. Like we
mm,
have very. I think both of us have had like a level of introspection about what we want to do with our life and how we want
mm,
to exist in the world that isn't common. And I've been teaching for decades, and I meet a lot of people who are
mm,
middle aged or above and haven't done this work due to their culture, due to their upbringing. And as you said,
mm,
coming from the Midwest, like you said, you have experience with people that are like his parents, right? Just very salt of the earth, no questions, just like plodding along. And I
mm,
think even the passage I just read at the end, where he says, like, he ends his review of his life by saying, "What did you expect?" Like, I think that's just that's a way a lot of people live their lives is what did you expect? They don't do the introspection. They don't do any inner work, you know? And so I wasn't surprised that he didn't
mm,
ever have a moment saying, "What am I doing with my life?"
mm.
I was just disappointed.
Yeah, I guess maybe a better way for me to say it is like I find that lack of introspection on behalf of Stoner to be inconsistent with who he is. He's not a
Yeah,
farmer.
I agree.
He's not a forklift
I
driver
agree.
or whatever. You know and even anybody who goes through this kind of stuff in their life is going to have one of those moments where they just sit down and go, wait a
You'd
minute,
hope so.
what's really going on here? Like how, like I've, especially after Catherine leaves him, and he's just like, I think I was just looking at that line again. I should have leafed it, but oh yeah, he said she must have been planning her departure for some time. This is right at the end of chapter 13. Stoner
Mhm.
realized, and he was grateful that he had not known and that she left him no final note to say what could not be said. So
Mhm.
he's grateful that there's no like final moment where there could have been some kind of discomfort. And at the same time, there could have
Yeah.
been some kind of recovery where he could have said, hey, wait a minute, let's, let's work it out. Let's try to make it work. Let's figure something out. He's just, again, he's just so happy that the world has just done something to him and he can
Mhm.
just keep plodding along. It's just
I suppose. I mean,
I just find it really inconsistent with the character because he must have a high degree of intelligence in order to have a PhD, and
yeah.
have, you know, so I
But
just
I mean,
find it,
intelligence and emotional intelligence are wildly different, right? Like I've met a lot of people who don't have any emotional
yeah,
intelligence. Some of the smartest people in the world. Though I do
mm,
agree that he was studying great literature, including Shakespeare and other great literature, which in itself is like a site of introspection. So
mm,
what he
mm,
was studying, it would lend itself to being someone who engages engages in introspection. So I agree. But I read
yeah,
that as like he his relationship with Catherine is the one time that he let his emotions like exist. He allowed himself to feel anything because
mm,
before that, he had been hopeful when he first met Edith, and then he was like overwhelmed by that at the beginning. Then they got married, and
mm,
that he had to put a lid on that because it didn't go anywhere. And then they
mm,
had Grace, and when Edith went away, he had this great relationship with Grace, and that was really working for him. But then Edith kind of took Grace out of the picture because Edith viewed
yeah,
their marriage as a competition. So then instead of dealing with that, he just hid that emotion down. So when he met Catherine, it was the first time that he had a prolonged experience where he could feel things, right?
right,
Where he allowed himself to feel things. And so if he had known that she had already been planning on leaving and that she had anticipated this, that would have been like a betrayal to him. That would have
mm,
been like, you know, more emotion than he could take at the time. So the fact that
mm,
they both came to she didn't leave him. They came to this decision mutually that like,
mm,
this is the only way it could happen. Now, I think their logic was bad. Like, we wouldn't be
right,
us anymore, but they made this decision like mutually. So the fact that she just left without a trace after that, um,
mm,
I think was the only way that like she was being compassionate towards him, knowing that he didn't have the emotional resources to make this any more prolonged than it had to be. And he was
mm,
grateful for that fact. So
mm,
I read that as like her last compassionate moment of saying, like, I know this isn't going to work. Like, and
mm,
then doing what she has to do, and not drawing it out in any way. So I didn't read that
right,
quite the same, but I agree with your perspective that like it is his lack of introspection seems discordant with the life he lives as like this professor of amazing literature, which is in of itself all about like studying the human identity, right, through art.
right, yeah,
I
yeah,
agree. It
yeah,
seems, um, I don't know. I just think it's so well. Again, for me, like why this novel is contemplative is I look at like how he had that brief moment of joy and what that lasted less than one semester, like one summer, and then the
mm,
semester following that, give or take, like less than
mm,
a year. And in that, and he was 43 when that happened. Like he finally understood the
mm,
possibility that love offered to him when he was 43. And
yep,
and so that moment you see his life come alive in so many ways. And so for me, it gave me a real strong moment of saying like, what decisions do I make that are holding back my capacity to experience joy? And
mm,
how to live my life in such a way as to not be holding myself back? Because to see that
mm,
he held himself back for so long, that when he
mm,
finally leaned into something other than academia, and
yeah,
even in academia, he did find joy, but that was limited, right? It was transactional.
mm,
Once he was able to lean into a non-transactional emotional engagement with a human
mm,
being,
mm,
look at experience. So for me, that was like really powerful to see, and for me to think about like, what am I doing in my life that is not, that is me holding back, that is me creating walls, that is me, doing my own kind of minor type of disassociating to avoid obstacles or to avoid,
mm,
any sort of fissure. So for me, I thought that was really a powerful exploration of that. It's just sad. It was sad to see, you know.
mm. Yeah, yeah, I can see that.
I'm not swaying you. I can tell.
No, I mean, it's not a bad book. Like we've talked about earlier, there are, on a prose level, there are passages that are very beautiful and can be very touching passages. Um, I just found I just can't get over just like how passive the character is, and just how just out of touch with what's going on in his life and the people
Mhm.
around him too. And the thing I'm struggling with is, what is the point? And is it maybe, I mean, maybe that is the point, that this is how your life is if you don't examine it. And it's up to you to judge, is this a good life or not? You know? But I really take, like, I'm just wondering, like, am I reading the same book as all these other booktubers who say that this character is, so beautiful, and that the character development is just so amazing, because there is no character development. The character does not develop. And
Mhm.
I know as the reader, we are supposed to read into it and bring something to it. But as the writer, there should be some kind of like directions or signals, or some symbolism and things like that. Some moments where we know what's going on in this character, and why we're reading about this character. I guess that's the thing I just kept asking myself, is like, why am I reading
Mhm.
this book? What is the point? Um, it's I think that this would be, if this was a short story or a novella. I mean, it's already pretty short as a novel, but you read a lot of like literary fiction, short stories, contemporary short stories that are kind of like this, where it's just kind of a snapshot or a series of snapshots, and
Yeah.
it ends with that kind of like ellipses kind of moment where you need to bring something to it, right?
Mhm.
Raymond Carver is famous for this, where the stories just sort of end abruptly, and you need to bring something to it. But you can always go back in and read into it and find symbolism, or you can read into the character dialogue, and you find that the characters aren't necessarily talking to each other. Their characters are actually talking to the reader.
Yeah.
But I just don't see that. I just don't see that in any. Yeah, I just don't see that in this book, and that's why I just was so frustrated about it. It just feels like a big nothing. And like I said,
Well,
even that last couple of last passages right before he dies, they're touching and they're poignant, but at the same time they're kind of sad. Where like he's gone his whole life. He's gone his whole life without asking, or asking these questions, or coming to any sort of arrival.
mhm.
And I
Well,
just
I think that for me, he, what's interesting is that, and I've been saying that, like, he hides away from his emotions this whole time until he meets Catherine. But
Mhm,
part of that is because I think he does feel very deeply some things, and so the
mhm.
only way he can protect himself is to ignore it. And
Yeah.
for me, the point of the I don't think, um, I I think that what Williams is doing is dramatizing, um, a more or less, like I said, quotidian kind of life, like an everyday life. And I agree there are some things about his life that were not normal, like him becoming a professor, like out of
Yeah.
nowhere, having these like incredible moments. But at the same time, if you look at the up and downs of his life, he
Mhm,
had like all these different circumstances come to him that he wasn't expecting, and he had to make decisions about them. And some of them were good, and some of them were bad. Like his, enrollment in the university came out of nowhere. His love for English literature was unexpected. And then
mhm,
he's, you know what I mean? Like over and over again, he has his experiences. So in that way, I think it's a very normal life. Like I think many of us do experience many things, and then we
mhm,
become trapped in our own cycles. We become trapped in either cycles of despair or the cycles of attachment that we've created for ourselves due to our circumstances. So in that way, I think his life could be looked at as normal. And I think his lack
mhm.
of introspection is sadly not that uncommon, especially for, mid 20th century or early 20th century, right? When
Mhm,
he was,
mhm.
when this book takes place. And that I think the level of introspection we bring to our lives now is much more than I would have expected of him. Even
Mhm,
though he was, even less than I think maybe possible.
mhm,
But my point is that by dramatizing a somewhat normal life that
mhm,
has some extraordinary things, but some very mundane and normal things, it gives an opportunity to reflect on my life. So I didn't
mhm,
expect him to put in these moments of like him using Stoner or his experiences to really talk about something else other than one very simple life, and
mhm,
a life that did not become what it could have become, that was
mhm,
kind of stilted right from the beginning. So I didn't expect that level of subtext. I thought the subtext was in us examining that person. And, for me, thinking of the lives people live, like, I definitely had professors, both in high school and in college, that
mhm.
seemed very normal. Like, I'm sure for many of his students, like, they just thought he was like a guy, especially at the end when he became
Mhm.
like, haunting the walls, that he
Yeah.
was just like a fixture of the university, that they didn't give a single moment's thought to the whole life this man lived, and to the
Mhm,
many possibilities for joy that he didn't have, to his depression, to all the things he had given up or never succeeded in. Like that thought never crossed their mind, right?
mhm,
And
mhm,
so many people that I think that I've interacted with where I didn't like that didn't cross my mind either. I just thought they were a normal person, and this is just the way they were, and
mhm,
they weren't the cumulative result of their whole experiences, which I know nothing about.
mhm,
So for me, I think that is like a profound opportunity to reflect on that. And so I
mhm,
didn't think I didn't expect Williams to give more than what he gave. I appreciate what you're saying, though. A lot of literary fiction is using this as a way to explore something else. And I
Mm,
don't think he's doing that. I think he's just being very straightforward. Like, this is what a life could be. And how do you deal with that? Like, how do you wrangle with that, you
mm,
know? But speaking of what you're saying, I will say, I think talking a little bit about Sloane and about Stoner's death, I think is useful because when he is sick at the end, he talks about how similar he is to Sloane. And
yep.
he says, as Arthur Sloane had done, this is maybe in chapter 14. He says, as Arthur Sloane had done, he realized the futility and waste of committing oneself wholly to the irrational and dark forces that impelled the world toward its unknown end. As
Mm,
Arthur Sloane had not done, Stoner withdrew a little distance to pity and love so that he was not caught in the rushing that he observed.
mm,
And other moments of crisis and despair, he looked again to the cautious faith that was embodied in the institution of the university.
mhm.
So I think our comparisons between him and Sloane are really apt. But the difference is, as I was saying, I think he actually has these strong emotions that he isn't good at navigating. And so his sense of pity and despair is what made him different um, than Sloane in that
Right.
way. Or his
Yep.
sense of pity and not despair, his sense of pity and almost like compassion for
Right.
the craziness going on around him. But
Yeah.
then that affected him and made him despair, you
Yep.
know? But so that I think is what separated him from Sloane is
Mhm.
that he saw the futility, and Sloane's was directly due to, well, not directly, but World War One seemed to be the breaking point, right, for Sloane.
Yep.
But he saw the futility of people running around in circles and engaging in the harmful behaviors that they're behaving in,
Mhm.
and Sloane let that eat him eat him up from the inside out. And that's why he ended up this withered husk that like died in a rigid, slumped posture. Whereas
Mhm.
Williams tempered that with some sort of pity, some sort of empathy, which
Mhm.
made his life almost sadder, but it did allow him to not be as consumed by the whirlwind.
Right. Yeah. 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 That is interesting, and it's interesting that there are points where Sloane and Stoner kind of converge, and then there are points where they do tend to diverge. So I think
I
that
think
was
conscious faith in the
because it.
university is so interesting that the only
Mhm.
thing he has faith in, his only religion is university,
Right.
you know, and is
Yeah.
this like institution, which is so paralyzing to me. That's so
Mhm.
like disheartening that like that is the only thing you have any faith in. And I
Mhm.
don't think you need to have spiritual practice or a religion, but like have faith in joy, have faith in yourself, have faith
Mhm.
in your friendships, like all these things that you could have found some sort of refuge in, some sort of if not salvation, at least comfort. But he
Mhm.
didn't look to any of those things. The only thing he looked to for comfort was the university, and even that was a cautious faith.
Yep.
And that
Yeah.
is like the saddest part of it. Like I don't think everyone needs a spiritual path to be happy, but I think
Mhm.
you have to have something in your life that you understand is making your life meaningful. And if the
Yep.
only thing that was making his life meaningful was his work at the university,
Yeah.
which was subject to so many other people's whims,
Yep.
as we
Yep.
see when Lomax took
Yep.
over, then how
Yep.
is that a thing to have faith in? You know, like
Yep.
you're setting yourself up for disaster.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. I think.
So,
Yeah, that's interesting. And again, I just kind of kept asking, like, okay, so what should I read into this? What am I supposed to take away from this? You know, to me, it was like almost a sense of futility.
mm,
It's like it's a
yeah,
weird sense of like diligence, but also futility, and like that's all he's got. I mean, the moment like when he dies, he's literally just touching his books,
hmm
and that
hmm
that's it. And it's just sort of like I kept trying to think like what is that supposed to mean? Like what is I mean, I know you bring your own meaning to it, but at the same time, like what was Williams trying to where was Williams trying to lead us? You know what I mean? Um I don't know. It's just too problematic to me. I wonder if it's
yeah,
just a book. I wonder if it's a book too that is just sort of like maybe at its time was a bit bold
mm,
by not having theme be so overt and so prominent by having it be sort of a canvas that with a very sort of like spare picture painted onto it, and we bring in the color, so to speak, or the details. But I think maybe now
mm.
I don't know. I wondered if now it's just something that's just a bit like maybe past its time or something like that. I
Yeah, it could be. I really think just like having listened to maybe about a half dozen, maybe a dozen different people talk about it, I
Mhm.
really think that that introduction has shaped
Yeah,
how a lot of people read this book, to be
yeah,
honest, which is
yeah.
like, and I also could be open to the fact that like, obviously we both um didn't have the experience they did, even though I enjoyed the book and you didn't. Our
Mhm,
experience, I think, was somewhat parallel compared to many other booktubers.
mhm.
Um, maybe we're wrong. Like maybe he did have this like really beautiful life and we just don't see it. Like that's a possibility. Like I leave myself open to that. But ultimately, I think that like that introduction really shaped the way people read it. And
Yeah,
that's fine. Like if you found meaning in the book that way, then that's great. But for me, that distracted me from the book and made me feel like adversarial with the book. Um,
yeah.
I will say, so I guess I don't know if we have much more to say about that, considering I think we both kind of exhausted uh,
Mm,
our experience. There are a few, just a few like literary things that I thought were really beautiful
mhm.
that I might pull out just as a way maybe to end this not being such a downer, but as a way to appreciate at least that the language, at least for me, and the way he
Yeah,
structured it pulled me
yeah.
through. I think right at the beginning of the 10th chapter, when he describes his relationship with Finch, when he says his relationship with Finch was casual, deep, and so guardedly intimate that it was
Mhm,
almost impersonal. Like, I don't even know what that means,
mm,
but it sounds great. And it also is like the perfect description of how he was with Finch. That
mhm.
this guardedly intimate, like Williams does this a lot, is that he um, uses an adverb to describe an adjective where they seem contradictory, such as
Yeah,
like a rigid, rigidly
yeah,
and guardedly intimate. But
yeah.
it doesn't seem it's not just for like he's not doing it like for shits and giggles. Like I think he's doing it to like really create this poetic impact and
Mm,
that works, you know. So there's one. Um I also think like I really liked this line. It was actually it made me laugh out loud a little bit. I don't know if it was supposed to, but right before his he began his affair with Catherine. So
mhm,
before he began the affair, right, he read her dissertation and he fell in love with it, and he
mhm.
went to her apartment and like talked about it all night, right?
Yep.
And then he left her apartment that night, and he left the apartment and it says the smell of smoke from trash burning in backyards was held by the mist, and as he walked slowly through the evening, breathing the fragrance and tasting upon his tongue the sharp nighttime air, it seemed to him that the moment he walked in was enough, and that he might not need a great deal more. And then
Mhm.
paragraph break. And so he had his love affair. Like for me,
Yeah,
I think that's like great position. Like he had everything. He didn't need anything more. And so he had an affair. Like
yeah,
just that line, I think is beautiful.
yep,
Like just to put
yep,
it up that way, I think is
yeah,
really, really skillful.
yeah,
And then when their relationship dissolves, of course they talk about the dissolution of their relationship via grammar, which I think
yep.
is interesting, right? Because he met her in a class where he cared only about grammar, and
Mhm,
that's what he wanted to talk about. And it says, like the end of their relationship, it says they revealed that knowledge by grammatical usage. They progressed from the perfect, we have been happy, haven't we, to the past, we were happy, happier than anyone, I think. I think
mhm.
that is just perfect. That is such a great way of Williams like showing what these characters were, right? And
Mhm,
like what an important thing literature and language and academia was to them
mhm.
was that like their love language is grammar, which I
Yeah,
thought was really beautiful.
yeah,
Um, so there are moments like that that I really,
yeah,
really appreciated, you
yeah,
know?
yeah, yeah. I liked too. I thought I forget what chapter am I in, where yeah, chapter 10, um, where he's with Holland.
Mhm.
Um, and there's this
Holly?
sort of yeah, there's this sort of questioning that's going on. It's Stoner took a deep breath, still looking at the ghost of his face in the mirror-like finish of the tabletop. He said
Mhm.
expressionlessly, "Mr. Walker, I'm going to ask you for a few questions about English literature. They will be simple questions and they will not require elaborate answers. I shall start early and I shall proceed chronologically so far as time will allow me. Will you begin by describing to me the principles of Anglo-Saxon versification?" But just that line where he looks at himself in the mirror-like finish of the tabletop, I thought that was really interesting, and I realized that that kind of echoes back. There's a really famous story by James Joyce, um, Araby. It's in the Dubliners collection, um, and it's something I'm sure it's happened before him too, and it goes all the way back into like the classical myths of Narcissus looking at his
Oh, yeah.
reflection. And so I thought that was really interesting that, and I wondered if Williams had purposely done that to sort of echo James Joyce, who was echoing, countless other writers before him. So there is just some like amazing writing in here, like just little passages that are
If you
amazing.
think of myth, right? Like the narcissist myth is that he sees his reflection
Yeah,
in the river
yeah,
and he's so infatuated with himself, right? Whereas this, it's
yeah,
the opposite. He sees
yeah,
his reflection and it's dispassionate. It's like
yeah,
the exact opposite of the narcissist myth because he
yeah.
doesn't have a sense of internal drive or attraction.
Right.
That's
Yeah,
interesting. That's a really good catch.
yeah. Yeah, so it's like I don't know. It's a weird book. It's to me, it's like like I said, it's written so well. It's hard to not like it. But when I find myself thinking about it, I'm like, okay, what beyond the text of it, what is there to like about it? So I guess if I were to rate it, I wouldn't trash it. I would say it's a 4. It's not. I would not say it's a 5. It's definitely
Mhm.
Williams is definitely a masterful writer and someone to be highly respected. But
Mhm.
I just feel like I think like I had said before, like I feel like the writing is almost wasted on a story that doesn't have a story.
That's how I read it, as a cautionary tale. And I'm almost thinking of like medieval literature and everyman literature, where
Mm,
there is a person who goes about some sort of journey, and they serve as cautionary tales, right? And that's what this
mm,
reads as to me, is a cautionary tale.
mm,
And it's interesting because it's so close. It's the novel that's most closely related to his life, and though they say it isn't autobiographical, yet it is also the most closely related to
mm.
what it means to be a professor, which is what he's done his whole life.
Yeah.
And with that in mind, I just think the idea of it being a cautionary tale, and not a celebration of a small life, but instead a
Mm,
cautionary tale of what it means to not embrace the opportunities you have and
yep.
to constantly pick the wrong fights, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
not like the one fight you pick is the wrong one.
Yep.
And for me, that reading it as a cautionary tale made me enjoy it quite a lot. I also gave it 4 stars, 3.5 to 4 stars. Um, because I enjoyed it at the end more than you did, but also just the language. And I thought, I don't know, I always struggle to think like, does the authorial intent matter? Right? Like when I experience a book, how much does the authorial intent matter? And
Hmm.
so for me, I know reading it in the beginning, right away, being told from Williams' own mouth that this is not
Yeah.
a story about a sad life, that affected my reading of it. But in reflection,
Hmm.
I don't think the authorial intent matters. So maybe he did mean that. Like maybe his goal was to show like the beauty of a simple life. But I don't care about that because for me,
Hmm.
reading it the way I did made it meaningful to me. So I agree. I gave it 4 stars. I
Hmm.
think the language alone like, pulled me through. It didn't. I never wanted to stop reading it. And you're right, it is
Hmm.
short, which also helps. And the chapters are like really, really well paced.
Yeah.
I like also like, there are moments where Williams in his writing he gives away things that other people would have spent a long time on. So after
Yeah.
that whole situation with Holly Lomax and Walker, there's just a line that says, "And the two men didn't speak directly again for another 20 years." Like he
Yeah.
just says that and then moves
Yeah.
on, right? And
Yeah.
that's the kind of thing that other authors would just milk, and they would like create so much tension
Yep.
out of like the interactions between those two characters. And Williams is like, no, like that's not what I need to do here. I'm going to set the
Yeah.
scene, and you fill
Yeah.
in the rest of this. So I really appreciated that,
Yeah.
and so because of that, like I think I enjoyed it a little more than you, but also
Mhm.
I don't think there's a point, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
interesting how much empathy he gave to Holly Lomax, and um,
Mhm.
when Stoner realized that Lomax believed what he was saying, right? Like when Stoner realized that Lomax really believed everything he was saying about Walker, and he really believed that Stoner was like singling him out because he was
Mm.
disabled and doing all these, like he created a really like Lomax was like a really awful character who had a
Yep.
really obviously a really negative effect on Stoner's
Yeah.
professional life.
Yeah.
And he wasn't painted as a villain. He was painted as someone who misunderstood a situation, and he was so
Mhm.
deep in his misunderstanding that he couldn't ever fix it, which is the same thing Stoner was,
Yep.
right? It was just a different situation. And
Yeah.
so you saw how that kind of poisoned attitude affects others as well, which I thought was actually really interesting, having Lomax and
Mhm.
Stoner as being in the same situation, whereas they don't understand the world around them and they aren't being
Yep.
introspective. And I
Yep.
think neither of them are. And he can recognize that in Lomax, but he can't recognize it in himself. I think
Mm.
just adds to the tragedy of the story.
Yeah.
But I thought
Yeah.
it was a really beautiful way to set them up against each other.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that, I mean, that does present maybe one way to sort of look at the book, is that it presents this world of this very small world within this university of kind of broken people,
Mm,
and for some reason they all are sort of collected in this place, and how they go about interacting with each other, and Stoner, who isn't as broken as some of the others, and yet he's sort of subjected to the whims of these people, and this world. So, and what he's willing to put up with, because he loves literature so much, he puts himself through sort of all the trials and tribulations that the Lomaxes and the Sloanes and the
mhm.
Walkers, he kind of deals with all that in order to stay with his world of books, as his father would say, to stay with his books. So,
Yeah, exactly.
so, and that was an
I think the
interesting, like, kind of an interesting, like, almost full circle. Like, his father says, I think that's his father's line, right? You stay here with your books,
yeah,
and
exactly.
that
Yeah, that line.
literally, he literally dies with his books. So, you
It's a
know,
very Rosebud moment, right? Like at the end of his life,
yeah,
like all he wants is his books. Though to be
yeah,
fair, at that like what else could he have at that moment that had any meaning to him? And it's not even his books; it's like the book he wrote, right? It's his one contribution that will outlive
mm,
him, with a
mm,
boring dissertation that no one will ever read, and
yep,
he acknowledged it isn't especially great. You
yeah,
know,
yeah,
that's like his mark on the world. I
yeah.
think the real interesting thing will be like in 2 months, like if you are thinking of this, like that will be like the test if there's any value to this,
That's true. Yeah,
because
yeah,
like I can read something and be very frustrated by it, but it can linger, and
mm,
for better or worse can cause me to like reflect on things. And so
yeah,
I think like that this is the kind of book that has that potential,
yeah,
because I have seen I've seen myself in very similar situations to him. None the exact same, but somewhere I had to make decisions where I could either stand up for myself, or I could acquiesce, or I could withdraw within myself, and I had to
mm,
find a balance. And
mm,
what I do, obviously, I have a different kind of emotional and spiritual backing, making
mm,
choices, or
mm,
or um, mediating the choices I make, than Stoner had. But
yeah,
that's the kind of thing I can look at my life and say, okay, like what do I want to do in this situation? And like this
mm,
book is a something that will linger with me, just to see like what happens when you don't make the right choice, or
yeah,
over and over again, kind of.
yeah, yeah.
So that'll be interesting in a few months. You see if you
That's very true. And I mean, I always think that too. Like, a book is really good when it does stick with you, and when you come back later asking, maybe I didn't get that right the first time, and sometimes you pull it off the shelf, and you look for certain sections again to try to find out, like,
Mhm.
what was really going on there. Maybe I understand that the right way. So, yeah, we'll see. I mean, I definitely want to read more of his writing, and I'm curious. This book actually was, I think one of his, like, worst selling books or worst received books. He won the National Book Award for Augustus,
Mhm.
which I think is sort of like a character study, probably like this was, of Caesar, of Augustus
That
Caesar.
one's, yeah, but it's all epistolary.
Yeah.
Augustus is entirely epistolary,
Oh, okay. Okay,
so
I
it's
didn't know that. Didn't know that.
letters
And
from
then he
different
also
perspectives.
has
I mean,
he has kind of a Western Butcher's Crossing, which I have, and I
mm,
picked it up and leafed through it, and that looks quite good. So,
mhm.
and I think that's, from what I've read, that's more of a commentary of, like, the hunting that took place in the West, as the American West was, quote unquote, discovered um, by white people, basically, but about, of just like
Yeah,
the mass destruction of wildlife.
'cause I agree, there wasn't narrative. That's the whole point. Is this is a
Yep,
very um, dramatizing what should not be dramatic, right? Like
yep,
that's the whole kind of
yep,
purpose of this book,
yep,
it's a slice of life of someone who is not spectacular, who does not do
mm,
spectacular things. Yet there are still moments of his life that are worthy of reflection. And
mm,
so, as someone who is not spectacular and does not do spectacular things, it makes me think of what in my life, like how would a slice of my life be dramatized? But
mm,
I agree, it'd be interesting to read other books by Williams and see
mm,
how his
mm,
literary technique applies to more narrative-driven structures. I agree.
yeah,
That's it'd
yep,
be worthwhile. We came to a good place. I kind of reversed my position as far as liking it or not liking it, though and you kind of aren't a big fan, but we both agree that it's beautifully written, and we both kind of agree that everyone else is wrong about Stoner and we're right. So that's a good place to end.
That's the most important place to end at right there. We're right. Everyone else is wrong.
I say that flippantly. I think whatever people got from the book, whether they were influenced by that introduction or not, that really horrible introduction or not, is great. Like, I think anything you get out of literature is great. But for me, it's much more meaningful the way I read what I understood of Stoner made this book more meaningful to me. And I think you and I both agree about that. How far that takes is different.
Yep. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Totally agree with you on that. Yep.
Well, I guess I just want to say thank you for suggesting this buddy read. I know that it was maybe a little more pleasurable for me than for you, given the way your final experience in the book. But for me, it was a great chance to read this book. I've been wanting to read it for a long time, and being able to actually talk it out with someone as opposed to just being frustrated by it by myself made it much more enjoyable. So I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it too. It's been great discussing it. I never would have finished this book if we hadn't done this. I probably would have started it again and would have stopped it again and just like given it away to someone else. So I think it's good. I mean, it's okay to not always be wowed, by everything, and it's good to read things that you don't necessarily like, but that you can take something away from it. And I think what helps you take, at least for what helps me take something away, is the exchange of ideas and sort of the discussion and getting other angles of looking at it. Like, I never would have thought of like the psychological aspect when you were talking about the disassociation that he has. I never would have thought that. So that's a really interesting way to look at it. So yeah, definitely, this was great. If you want to do another one of these again sometime, just let me know. I know you're quite busy, I think, in the next month that's coming up. And we've also had some technical issues too. So maybe if we can work some of those out.
So we can see if we can make it work. Okay, well, that sounds great. So thank you so much. And for everyone who has stuck in with us, who has been with us on this journey, I appreciate you coming along. Let us know what you think. Are you right like we are, or are you wrong about Stoner? We'd love to hear your position down in the comments.
Yeah. Please leave some comments. I know this is probably one of the biggest books on BookTube, so hopefully we can get some discussion there. So, okay. Well, I think we're done. Thanks a lot to everyone, and thank you to Lekden.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay.